This show is brought to you by Safety FM.
Welcome to the 27th episode of the Practice of Learning Teams. Today's podcast is part 2 of the discussion with the wise man Rob Fisher. Rob Fisher is one of the early adopters of human and organisational performance. Rob is based in North Carolina and his organisation, Fisher Improvement Technologies, is family owned and operated. Rob is in the business of doing by supporting organisations to embed HOP and programs like AERO, which stands for Advanced Error Reduction in Organisation. He calls his team the practical application people. We wrap up today's discussion with conversations about 1. Rob, Todd, and the tablecloth of work as imagined and work as done. Identifying and debriefing the gaps in operational learning. Systems resilience, and the notion that we cannot make a system resilient, we can make it more resilient or less resilient. And finally, learning teams and the restorative value that they bring to conflict. Before we start the podcast, we have some exciting news for our listeners. During the month of April, we will bring you a special 4-part series starting at episode 28 on a brand new learning teams facilitation framework using the Pdca model for facilitating learning, reflecting and improving your system. For those unfamiliar with Pdca, in the 1950s, management consultant Dr. William Edwards Deming developed a method of identifying why some processes don't work as hoped. His approach has since become a popular strategy framework. It allows organizations to formulate theories about what needs to change and then test them in a continuous feedback loop. Deming himself used the concept of plan, do, study, and act. He found that the focus on check is more about the implementation of a change. The focus of study is to understand why the change is working. He preferred to focus on studying the results of any improvements. The Pdca facilitation framework for learning teams has been developed by the authors of the Practice of Learning Teams to assist a facilitator in gaining knowledge and experience in conducting learning teams by framing some of the key concepts and thinking to be applied. Let us now listen to the wise man, Rob Fisher.
Todd Conk and I sat down in Norway and created this thing that has now become work as imagined versus work as done.
Yes, no, okay? I've seen the tablecloth.
Yeah, oh yeah, you've seen the tablecloth. Good. Yeah. So, but our thought in that was that adaptability is now a mandatory adaptability. It's a required adaptability because we didn't study, we just checked. And when you check, you only check what's there.
Correct.
When you study, it's a little bit bigger. So you could actually do that with the whole model and how we've applied it.
Oh yeah, and look, and we pushed it a bit further because what we talked to Todd about is we basically said that risk ebbs and flows. So
yeah, absolutely.
The black line thing, we actually pushed it a bit further. We talked about work as imagined, then it evolves to work as thought, then it evolves to work as reported or work as disclosed, then work as done. And what we're saying was that the learning opportunities exists as risk ebbs and flows.
Yeah, and what we were trying to describe was the question we ask in a little bit simpler form is, do we debrief the gaps? Whether that gap is an increase in margin to safety or a decrease in margin to safety.
Absolutely.
So how do you debrief a gap? Do a mini learning team, a micro learning team. You can use it in all different types of areas, but you have to put that in your process to do it, or it'll be the first thing that gets dropped.
And checking does not do that. So then the second part, when we looked at this, that we found, which also fascinated, was the fact that when Deming took those principles to Japan after World War II, and Toyota formed its component, when the Americans took those principles back from Toyota back to America and calling it Lean and Six Sigma and all these other languages, what was interesting is that they productized it into a tool, but removed the reflective component of it. Whereas the Japanese saw the reflection part as being the most critical to it.
Right.
And we found that really interesting because it's that ability to reflect is actually what matters. Because if a person can't reflect, how can that learning become deeply embedded?
Well, I think what we did was, in the big picture, when it came back, we didn't see it as a learning model. We saw it as a production model.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely.
So that, I mean, that allowed a whole bunch of
engineers.
It allowed a whole bunch of changes to be made that that of things that people didn't feel were needed from a production aspect, and you could just see where it was redlined out. Yeah, we don't need to do that. Why? Because it's already running. But if we design it right and it runs right, I don't need to reflect. It'll tell me when it goes wrong. The only thing is going to go wrong. Oh, failure modes and effects analysis. No problem. I do that and I find out, well, the only way I can fail is if it breaks. Well, we can see where that got us.
Correct. Absolutely. But isn't it interesting how the world keeps repeating itself?
Interesting in a, gosh, I'm not so glad it's 1918 again way. Yeah.
And look, I mean, what I've been saying to organizations is that COVID-19 has proven that systems are brittle and people are adaptable.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
And it's really interesting. This whole conversation about resilience is really fascinates me because, when I think about a system, I don't think of a system being a socio-technical component, which is, the system being, us and everyone together. I think of a system as being the systemization of something. And I think by nature, systems continue to be brittle because they can only see the world as being flat. Does that make sense? Because systems.
I can see how you can see it that way because that's the way the majority of times it's applied.
Yes, correct.
So we're kind of back to that. All models are wrong, but some are useful.
Well, I think people shouldn't be surprised that systems degrade.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that ought to be part of the education, right?
Correct.
Because the degradation of systems is predictable.
That's correct. But
just like the degradation of equipment is.
But I think what's happening at the moment is that there's this impression that systems through their design can be resilient.
Well, so now we're into a place that I like to spend time with senior leaders, in that you don't move into resiliency as a place that you've moved out of something else.
Right.
You make things more or less something. I have more capacity.
Yeah.
I have more. We are more resilient.
Yeah.
I'm going to say something that's going to piss a lot of people off.
Hey,
Can I say piss off?
Yeah,
okay.
Down here, that's a term of endearment.
Okay, good. This whole striving to be a highly reliable organization,
mm-hmm.
where are you going to draw the line?
Well, yeah.
And so look, here in the States, we use some examples of high reliability that, again, part of my background, I spent time in the Navy. Mm-hmm. I was on submarines. Yep. They would say, a submarine is a highly reliable organization, or an aircraft carrier is a highly reliable organization. Say, well, they killed 17 people in training accidents last year. Is that what you want to show as highly reliable to your organization? If that's your standard, but there's this whole cottage industry of high reliability now. I think we can increase reliability We can increase resilience, and we need to. We can increase capacity. We've got to understand the systemic elements of that. We use a task-based system that helps people increase their ability to see risks coming before that risk is unmanageable.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean we're eliminating risk and okay, we moved out of risk now. So I think we're kind of in violent agreement. But
and look, I think COVID-19 has proven, because every country has tried their own way. Some countries have followed science. Some countries have followed dictatorship. Some countries have taken different approaches. And you know, being 250 odd days into this pandemic, you can see which things have worked well and what haven't worked well.
I don't know that we can. I don't know that we are seeing what's worked well and what hasn't worked well, because we're not far enough into it to be on our way out yet. I think we've seen what has worked well to date. And so another thing that we're seeing over here is the science seems to be very flexible. So it's almost like common sense. If I believe in this strict thing that needs to be complied with, then that's science-based.
Sure.
If somebody else believes in something else, you know, and what might work in a country that is isolated by ocean and X million people may not work in a country that is not isolated by oceans and has 500 million people. So you know, it's got to be flexible. Well, that whole science piece is even the whole, yeah, okay, we know masks reduce, but that's not the way science is saying it. They say masks stop. No, they don't. Masks reduce. So you and I as practitioners of this, we get that pretty quickly, but the way the science is portrayed is the problem.
Look, I mean, I don't know, for instance, you know, we're a metric organization, we're a metric. Yeah. So for us, it's a 2 meter rule. In the US, it's a 6 feet rule, which is 1 point something meters. I don't think the virus can judge distance.
I'm absolutely certain it can't. And look, so we're told believe the science. Okay, so the way we believe science over here in the beginning was every time you go to a grocery store, you have to take Lysol wipes and you have to wipe everything that you bought in the grocery store down. And then the science changed 3 months in. They said, yeah, that's not really going to help. You can stop doing that. No. So we've had these step changes in what they say the science is, but then the places that have been quote unquote successful have used a science approach. Well, which one of them changed? Well, so it's hard to convince that many people.
Correct. The only science that's been consistent is the harm rates.
Is the what?
Is how much harm it causes. So what's really interesting is that you can't hide death.
Yeah. Well,
I know, but
now we shouldn't be on record. We're doing pretty well at that over here.
Yeah, well, and imagine there's some other countries that don't want to.
No, but it's the inverse.
I know, because
we've gotten a whole we put a whole bunch in that. The U.S. is amazing. We've had almost no deaths from flu this year. we usually have a lot, but this year we don't have any. We've had very few deaths from pneumonia, heart attacks, heart disease, emphysema. They've almost disappeared, these other diseases.
Right. But they died of something else.
Yeah.
Yeah. And look, and I'm with you. I mean, we've been very fortunate because we opted for an elimination eradication strategy, which basically meant that we recognised that the aged care industry was the group that was at most at risk. And even now, that group operates in a different mode to other groups, because once it takes hold, it just becomes rampant. So
we should have done that early on.
Yeah. So even though we've only got a population of 5 million and we've only had 25 deaths, what we looked at is that what we had seen is that through that isolation process, other respiratory-based type illnesses have dropped. Now, the underlying conditions of that person haven't changed.
Yeah.
Which means that when we move back to the normal flu season, we're probably going to see a bit of an increase as a result,
Yeah.
because those underlying factors haven't changed.
Yeah.
But that's got nothing to do with COVID-19. That's been with isolation. Now,
yeah.
what you'd have to ask yourself, what's been the effect of mental health on those people?
And that is that's this is going to sound insensitive.
Yeah.
To me, that's the real global pandemic issue.
People feeling isolated.
For all the different reasons, there's a multitude of reasons that are all coming together at a time in human history where we're more and more sensitive to things that might bother us. And so the human resilience to me is a little bit lower now than it has been in other generations. And that opens us up to these challenges that can come at you at multiple different directions. You know, there's some great folks down in your neck of the woods, especially Anna Faringa, who, if you don't know her, I encourage you to link up with her. She's a mental health expert there in Australia, and does a lot of work in Australia and New Zealand, that is helping companies start to focus on that attribute. We've even adopted some of the things that she's talked about and recommended in our own organization, just to, even though we're small, because we know that we need to be on top of it. But I completely agree with you that is a big deal.
Rob, me and my guys, we've been practicing mindfulness for over 5 years.
Yeah.
And I've always been a big fan of it, because it really helps to, it really, that whole reflective process, not being able to ruminate and be present, has been really, really helpful.
Yeah.
And like everything else, we call it risk homeostasis. That the moment we sort of try to go back to normal, we tend to drop all our defenses. And then the moment something happens, it's like we're having to relive the worst parts of it. And if you keep repeating that builds up all that type of harm and trauma. And I'm sure there's going to be some amazing learning teams that can come from this. But more importantly, I think both, these facilitated improvement teams and learning teams, I think, can be very powerful in a restorative way for workers as well. And
I agree.
Yeah, and we should be using them to help create that psychological safety that they need. Something that's not really being talked about.
Well, I get it's funny, I think it's great we're having this conversation. The phrase you just said is absolutely right. It hasn't been talked about. Those of us who've been doing it it's been a part of it,
practicing it,
but it's been under the carpet. It's been a natural result of the way that happens. One example, we use some tools to help with things to move companies down the road. We had a union and leadership mismatch that these folks hated each other.
Cool.
No other way to describe it. They hated each other. They only got in the same room because they were mandated by the big company,
right,
to be in the same room for a safety meeting once a month for 1 hour. When we started helping them learn, when we brought in the elements of a facilitated improvement team or a learning team to try and understand how they needed to think and behave differently as a group and as individuals within that group, the restoration happened in weeks, not months or years. I mean, things that took almost a generation to get as bad as it was were completely different within weeks. I mean, within 8 weeks, the union president was at the international union telling them how they restored the relationship between leadership and the workforce.
Yep.
And that's the power of using these teams if they're done right. If the facilitator does the right thing, if they coach the behaviors of the individuals within the team, and if the desired outcomes are something that the individuals in the organization needs.
Yeah, it's all that lovely alignment that comes out, and look at it.
Yeah.
And I've seen, repeatedly the power of it, and once again, organizations say to me, we just learnt more in the last 90 minutes than in years. How did that happen? How did it happen?
And if they don't say that, you better get reflective about how you conducted that learning team.
Absolutely, and that's really the key thing to it, because that's why that reflective component for a facilitator is so important. Because I think there's this thing that we're scared about, is that we think we have to be experts before we start the journey. No, we need to know some basic components. We need that coaching and that support on our journey. We need to know where we're at. We need to know where we're trying to go to. But ultimately, it's that ability to reflect. It's okay not to be perfect. Perfection doesn't exist.
Yeah, and so we've actually, sorry to interrupt, we've actually stopped using the term experts because that implies a destination instead of a journey.
Absolutely, but I suppose safety is full of experts.
All of which must fail because safety is still having problems with people getting hurt, maimed, and killed.
Yeah, absolutely, but it's sort of become...
So, I mean,
it's seen as a technical science.
Yes.
Technical science.
Well, that's I now sit on the advisory board for one of the major universities here in the States that produces safety professionals.
Yes.
And one of the reasons why I'm so excited about being on that board is because we're going to try to draw different people in. If you approach safety as a sustainability attribute instead of a technical attribute, then that approach is going to be completely different.
Right.
If you approach safety as the ability to create capacity and some additional organizational and individual resilience, that's a different way that those people get taught from the technical check boxes that most universities spit people out from.
Correct.
And I'm excited about that change.
And look, I'm 100% with you. I'm very fortunate. I teach the diploma in safety down here. I'm one of 5 people that teach it, and I teach the risk management component and learning teams. I don't call them learning teams, but what I do is I basically say that risk management is all about understanding its context. How do you create the opportunity to understand what does that context mean? And that every stakeholder views it in their own way. And that's where we came up with that term, functional diversity, that every stakeholder has a different view. And if they're not part of that and sharing their view of that, how can the organization learn?
Yeah, exactly. So, I have a podcast called the Essential Leadership Cycle Podcast.
Right.
And what we say are things like trust and diversity and inclusion, commitment, accountability, and learning. Those are all resultant conditions from 3 things: self and team awareness, shared vision and values, and clear roles and processes. Yeah. You get those 3 right, you can start to create the others. You get those 3 wrong, you're going to struggle with all those things.
It's going to inhibit that.
Yeah.
So Rob, just in wrapping up, what do you see as the future of these things? What do you see the future of sort of facilitated learning teams? What do you see the future as being?
Well, what I think is that the future is going to be that we're going to create methods and models that almost any organization can use. Some of those will be technology based. Some of them will be one-on-one or virtual based. But we're going to right size learning for the needs of organizations, especially smaller organizations.
Right. Yep.
You know, in the US and Canada, 75% of fatalities happen in companies under 100 people.
Yes, I agree. Yep.
They're not going to hire us to come in and help them do a learning team. We have to provide a service that helps them do that and benefit from it the right way when they can't afford having somebody come in and do it or anything else. And I think that, so that's one thing that's going to happen, is it's going to be right sized for a bunch of smaller organizations and done correctly. The second thing is I think it's going to be taught as a part of being a safety leader in safety leadership training, in colleges and universities, and in safety certification programs, so that people start to learn the attributes that are needed to be better at this thing that we've branded safety, which is really very undefined, but everybody thinks they've got a clear vision of what it is.
Sure.
So I'm excited about the technological attributes of it, because I think that we can create a lot of success criteria. We've now established what we call Fit Online. It's online.improvewithfit.com. And there's a whole bunch of freeware there so that people can learn about all the different little micro attributes that they can go out and use. So we'll have facilitated improvement teams as both a micro learning and as a paid course on there fairly soon. But I think that it's going to expand to a way that organizations understand how they can be better.
Right.
And what we're going to have to avoid is branding it in a way that makes it look like it's a big, huge deal, as opposed to something that almost anybody could do.
And look, that risk, and that's what we keep coming back to, weaponization. That's going to sadly happen because history keeps repeating itself in that regard.
Yeah.
What I like about what you're doing and what Todd's doing is that you've basically said, here are a set of core values, core philosophies. And if people stick to those core values and core philosophies, then you can do some adaptation and some change. But the moment you move away from those core things, then that's when things start to become weaponized in that way.
Yeah. And we've also gone a little step further in that we've started really being overt about what we know doesn't work.
Yeah.
So just like you would tell a worker, here's how a machine would fail, you can say, here's how these things fail and what you need to watch out for.
Yeah.
So we're giving them both success criteria and failure criteria, the failure modes and effects analysis of doing these things. So it increases their opportunity to not go out and be so creative that they fail.
Yeah, well, and you're helping to normalize the fact that failure is present.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Create that awareness. That's great.
Yeah.
And for our listeners, in our show notes, we'll have all the contact details for Rob and his organization as well. So, Rob, once again, a big thank you for taking time today as we lead up to the holiday season participating. And this podcast will be going out in the first part of early 2021.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. This has been a great conversation. Let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely, you betcha. Thank you, listeners, for being part of this podcast. We'd love to hear your learnings from today or other topics you would like us to support you on. Go to www.podcastlearnings.com and be part of the community of practice of learning teams at www.learningteamscommunity.com.
The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are those of the host and its guest and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the company. Examples of analysis discussed within this podcast are only examples. They should not be utilized in the real world as the only solution available, as they are based only on very limited and dated open source information. Assumptions made within this analysis are not reflective of the position of the company. No part of this podcast may be reproduced, stored in a retrieval system, or transmitted in any form or by any means, mechanical, electronic, recording, or otherwise, without prior written permission of the creator of the podcast, Jay Allen.